Imagine two worlds. In one, people still make most things by hand. Cloth is produced in workshops. Tools are made by individual craftsmen. Transportation depends heavily on animals, wind, and water. Then something changes. A machine begins doing the work of dozens of people. Factories appear. Steam engines begin powering production. Railways cross the land. And within a few generations, one part of the world is transformed. That place was Britain. And this transformation became known as the Industrial Revolution. But here's the question. Why did it happen there first? Africa was not an empty continent. Long before European industrialization, African societies had their own industries, trade networks, metalworking traditions, agricultural systems, and powerful states. West African merchants moved gold, salt, textiles, and other goods across enormous distances. Cities such as Timbuktu became centers of trade and scholarship. In other parts of Africa, ironworking and craft production supported local economies. So, why did an African industrial revolution happen at the same time? Was Europe simply more advanced? Not so fast, because the story is much more complicated. And the first clue is hiding underground. For thousands of years, humans depended mainly on muscles. Human muscles, animal muscles, wind, water. Then Britain found a powerful new source of energy. Coal. Coal could be burned to produce enormous amounts of heat, and that heat could help power machines. Britain had large coal deposits, and many were relatively accessible. This became increasingly important as industrial production expanded. But here's where the story gets interesting. Coal alone did not create the Industrial Revolution. If it did, every country with coal would have industrialized first. That didn't happen. The machine needed something else. Technology. Engineers improved steam engines. Inventors developed new machinery. Factories brought workers and machines together, and production became faster and larger. Britain's industrial growth was also supported by investment, infrastructure, trade, and a growing pool of skilled workers. Historians studying Britain's industrialization point to a combination of investment, human capital, technological progress, geography, and institutions rather than one single cause. So now we have two clues: energy and technology. But we're still missing something. Because Britain didn't exist in isolation. It was connected to a much larger world. And that world included Africa. By the time Britain began industrializing, European powers had already spent centuries building global trading networks. And Africa was deeply connected to those networks. Gold, ivory, palm products, cotton, and tragically enslaved Africans. The Atlantic slave trade became one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Millions of Africans were violently taken from their homes and transported across the Atlantic. This trade generated enormous human suffering. It also became connected to European commercial networks, plantations, shipping, finance, and manufacturing. But we need to be careful here. It would be wrong to say Europe became industrial because of slavery. That is far too simple. Historians continue to debate how large the direct economic contribution of slavery was to Britain's industrialization. Industrialization had many causes, but there's another important point. Britain's Industrial Revolution happened inside a world economy that European powers had been building for centuries, and that global system helped Britain access markets, raw materials, capital, and commercial opportunities. Then something even more important happened. Britain didn't just trade with the world. It began producing goods on a scale the world had never seen before. And one industry became the perfect example: textiles. For centuries, Indian cotton textiles were famous around the world. They were colorful, they were high quality, and European consumers wanted them. But British manufacturers had a problem. They wanted to produce cotton cloth faster and more cheaply. So inventors began creating machines that could spin and weave cotton at incredible speeds. Factories grew, production exploded, and Britain increasingly became a major exporter of manufactured textiles. Think about what just happened. The world had always traded goods, but now machines were allowing one country to produce goods on an entirely different scale. This is one of the most important differences between a traditional economy and an industrial economy. It isn't simply about having skilled workers. It's about using machines, energy, capital, and organization to produce far more than before. And once Britain had this advantage, it became easier to build more factories. More factories meant more production. More production created more profits. More profits could finance more machines. And the cycle continued. Industrialization began feeding itself. But now we have to ask something uncomfortable. If Africa had skilled workers, resources, trade networks, and large populations, why didn't the same cycle begin there? And this is where geography and history start to collide. Africa is enormous. It has deserts, tropical forests, savannas, mountains, huge rivers, and thousands of kilometers of coastline. That geography created enormous opportunities, but it also created challenges. Moving goods over land could be difficult. Some major rivers were difficult to navigate continuously because of waterfalls, rapids, or changing conditions. And in many tropical regions, diseases such as malaria created serious challenges for human settlement and economic activity. But geography doesn't mean Africans were incapable of developing industries. That's an important distinction. Africa had sophisticated economies long before European colonial rule. The question is not, why couldn't Africans build anything? The question is, why did industrialization take off in Africa at the same time and in the same way? And one possible answer is that industrialization requires more than resources. It requires a very specific combination of conditions: reliable energy, large markets, investment, infrastructure, technology, skilled workers, political stability, and institutions that allow businesses and inventors to invest for future. Europe had developed some of these conditions in particular places, and Britain had an especially powerful combination. Political competition within Europe also mattered. Some historians argue that Europe's fragmented political landscape encouraged rulers to compete for merchants, trade, and economic activity, while institutions such as parliaments and self-governing cities sometimes created greater room for commerce. But there is another factor we cannot ignore. Europe was not simply developing internally. It was expanding outward. By the 1800s, industrialization had changed Europe's military and economic capabilities. Factories could produce weapons, ships, textiles, tools, and other goods at enormous scale. Steam power made transportation faster. Railways transformed movement. And European states increasingly used industrial capabilities to expand their influence around the world. Then came the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa. European powers seized control of huge parts of the continent, and this changed Africa's economic path. Colonial governments built railways and ports in many places, but these systems were often designed around the needs of colonial economies. Resources were moved from mines and farms toward ports. Raw materials were exported. Manufactured goods were imported. This helped connect African economies to global markets. But it often did not create the same kind of broad industrial transformation taking place in Europe. Instead, many territories became heavily focused on producing commodities for export. That pattern left a lasting legacy. Even today, many African economies remain major exporters of raw materials and agricultural commodities, while manufacture remains less developed than in major industrial economies. The World Bank notes that sub-Saharan Africa's integration into manufacturing value chains has often been concentrated in primary products and lower-skill activities. But there's something important we need to understand. Colonization did not cause Africa to miss the Industrial Revolution in the first place. Britain's Industrial Revolution had already begun before the scramble for Africa, so colonialism cannot be the entire explanation. But colonialism did shape the path African economies took afterward, and that distinction matters. No, and this may be the biggest misconception of all, there was nothing inevitable about Europe becoming the first industrial center. Even historians disagree about why the divergence happened. Some emphasize coal, others emphasize institutions. Others point to wages, markets, global trade, political competition, empire, technology, or ecological conditions. And some historians have challenged the idea that Europe was dramatically ahead of every other region before industrialization. Advanced parts of China and India, for example, had sophisticated economies and living standards that were not simply primitive compared with Europe in the 18th century. So the story isn't, Europe was advanced, Africa was backward. The real story is, different regions had different advantages and different constraints. Britain happened to combine several powerful advantages at a critical moment: coal, technology, investment, trade, political institutions, human capital, and access to global markets. Once industrialization began, the gap could grow very quickly because industrialization doesn't just create wealth, it creates the ability to create more wealth. And this brings us to the real lesson. A country doesn't become an industrial power simply because it has resources. Africa has enormous deposits of minerals, but minerals underground are not the same as factories above ground. Having iron ore doesn't automatically create steel companies. Having oil doesn't automatically create advanced petrochemical industries. Having young people doesn't automatically create a skilled workforce. Resources need electricity. Workers need education. Businesses need investment. Factories need transportation. And industries need access to markets. This is why the story of industrialization is really a story about systems. Britain didn't just discover coal. It built a system around energy, machines, finance, transportation, markets, and production. South Korea later demonstrated a similar lesson in a completely different era. It had far fewer natural resources than many African countries, but it invested heavily in manufacturing, infrastructure, education, and exports. The result was transformation, and that brings us to Africa today. The Industrial Revolution may have started in Britain more than 2 centuries ago, but Africa's industrial story is not finished. The continent has enormous reserves of minerals needed for modern technologies. It has one of the world's youngest populations. Its cities are growing. Its consumer markets are expanding. And African businesses are increasingly connected to global markets. But the question is no longer, why didn't Africa industrialize first? That question belongs to history. The more important question is, can Africa industrialize faster now? Can African countries move from exporting raw materials to processing them, from importing finished products to manufacturing them, from simply providing resources to building companies around those resources? Because imagine what happens when a country doesn't just export cocoa, but manufactures chocolate, doesn't just export cotton, but produces clothing, doesn't just export minerals, but processes them into advanced materials. That is where more value can stay inside the economy. And perhaps that is the most important lesson from the Industrial Revolution. The countries that gain the most from their resources are often not the ones that simply have them. They are the ones that learn how to transform them. So, why did Europe industrialize before Africa? There was no single answer. Coal mattered. Technology mattered. Institutions mattered. Trade mattered. Political competition mattered. Global connections mattered. And history mattered. But none of these explanations should make us believe that Africa was destined to remain poor or unindustrialized. History is not a ranking of continents. It is a chain of choices, opportunities, accidents, and constraints. And the next industrial revolution may not look like the first one. It may be powered by technology, renewable energy, digital systems, manufacturing, and African innovation. So the question isn't only, why did Europe industrialize first? The question that matters now is, who will build Africa's next industrial revolution? And perhaps, why couldn't it be Africa itself? What do you think? Was Europe's early industrial advantage mainly caused by geography and resources? Or did politics, institutions, trade, and historical circumstances play the bigger role? Let me know in the comments. And subscribe to Africa Explained for more documentaries that uncover the questions behind Africa's history, economy, and future.